זה הדור שגדל. עכשיו סימון עכשיו.
שלום לכולם, ברוכים הבאים לצהרי יום ג'. Hello everyone, thank you all. Welcoming you to this special gathering with the Ambassador, Dr. Yevgen Kornichuk, the Ambassador of Ukraine in the State of Israel. Thank you, Sir Frank Lowy, for being here, Mr. David Lowy, Professor Mano Trachtenberg, the head of INSS. I will briefly introduce you, and then you will start the conversation. Very impressive resume. You were first, if you don't know this, of course, I'm telling you. You were the first Deputy Minister of Justice of Ukraine, a member of both the 5th and 6th Parliament Conventions, lecturer of the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, head of the Division of International Treaties of the Legal Treaty Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, chief consultant of the Protocol Organizational Division of the Protocol Service of the President of Ukraine, vice consul in New York, and consultant in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine. You also, very important, you hold a PhD in International Public Law from Kiev Institute of State Law. Please.
So now you learn about yourself. So, Mr. Ambassador, let me welcome you warmly to the INSS. For us, it's an honor to have you with you. We appreciate that you took the time to come to us in this really faithful and horrendous hour for Ukraine, for Europe, and for all of us. So, before we go to the discussion of what's going on there, let me say loud and clear, bombing cities, harming innocent civilians is wrong, is immoral, is unacceptable. And in that respect, there is no on the one hand, on the other hand. And so, I think I'm speaking for the vast majority of Israelis. We condemn these acts of violence in an unqualified manner. Yet the way we translate this very clear sentiment into political action obviously has to take into account the vital interests of our country. As you know well, Russian tanks are stationed 220 kilometers from the way we are sitting, from the place we're sitting here. Just 220 kilometers from here. This is our predicament. And our government is trying hard to figure out what's the right course of action in light of that predicament. Mr. Ambassador, I hope you can help us and our government to clarify what the right path is. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me today. I wish I'll come here with a different occasion, but we have to face the reality the way it is. And the reality is that we have in the act of barbarian war, the genocide of the Ukrainian people, something that Europe haven't seen for over the last 70 years. So if you wish, for Israelis, that's going to be something similar as the Yom Kippur War. Unfortunately, it's just greater and longer already for us than the Yom Kippur for Israel. So, assuming that, I'm a qualified lawyer with both Ukrainian and US diploma on international public law, I'm acting rather as a lawyer than the ambassador, but clearly from the academical standpoint, it's very difficult to just properly react to what's going on because of if you are trying to look for the rationale, it doesn't have any rationale. Don't try to measure the current situation with the logic. Once again, it doesn't have logic. It has the emotion. Our northern neighbors hated us so heavily that they started this barbarian action against the whole nation. And so far, our armed forces are doing well, stopping them, but the number of the civilian casualties is just coming by thousands and thousands and thousands, and we don't see the end for this story. Clearly, Russian leadership, they failed to get immediate victory, but still, even after the 12 days of war, they've been looking for nothing but the surrender of the Ukraine. And that's not going to happen. Our people will stay strong, and we prove to be deeply supporting the European democracy's principles that we share with the rest of the democratic world. And we don't want to be the part of the Russian Empire anymore. We've been there for a long time. We don't want to get there again. So, in terms of the situation, clearly the Russian leadership was looking for the fast result that will come up with a surrender of Kiev, or Kharkiv, and having the march of victory in Kiev. So they found the parade uniform of the soldiers that they brought with them. So they're supposed to have a parade in Kiev already, according to their strategy. But there's going to be no parade. And I'm talking about that with a deep sorrow because of, once again, the price for both parties is unacceptable, especially for our party, when our civilian people are dying and we are not allowed to establish the humanitarian corridors in order to evacuate civilians from the big cities. It's just meaning that we are coming to the slaughter. The Second World War was the same thing. You can, basically, you can speak, if you talk about Kharkiv now, or Mariupol, it's a big city. It was up to 600,000 people lived there. I don't know how many left. But they are bombing the way they bombed Aleppo. They are doing the same. Kharkiv.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm too emotional. So it's about Kharkiv is the second biggest city in Ukraine, with a population about 1.5 million. And also the foreign students, including Israelis, that did not happen to evacuate on time, and we are having casualties there as well, with the foreigners, not just with the Ukrainians. And the people are sleeping underground in shelters for the metro stations for the last 2 weeks. And it's a shortage of food, of course, the shortage of the pharmaceutical products. And we are dealing with that. The central government is staying in Kiev. The cabinet of ministers is working under their daily routine. The president took the command and stay there strong, and seeking for the international aid, of course, because once again we are facing much bigger power. I wouldn't say stronger or advanced in terms of the missiles, but not in terms of the soldiers. We are seeking for the international assistance on all possible spheres, including for the Israel, if we talk about this country that we all believed is our close friend and the partner. We expected all kind of support, of course, including the defensive weapon and self-protection, at least like helmets and safe vests, etc. One of the important initiatives that we was discussing for months was that we finally see the active mediation position that was taken by the Prime Minister Bennett. And he flew to Kyiv, to Moscow, over the weekend and has a talk with the Russian president. And then, in cooperation with Germany and France, they liaison together with the Americans and trying to be successful with this mediation effort. But I have to remind you that we also be asking for the mediation effort for over the last year. And I was sitting in a room with your former Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has held the excellent relations with the Russian President Putin. And after the conversation, he told me that, yes, this is a Middle East business to be a good mediator, and we'd love to be, but we could be successful mediators only when two parties want to agree. And here over the table, I can see just one party that wants to agree, which is you. So this is, I think that even since the warfare, the slaughter of the Ukrainian people, not much have been changed in the minds of our adversaries. So they are trying to get the control over the country. They foresee that's not easy or simply not possible, what I believe is true. But the time is running and we are having the civilian casualties every minute, not every day, unfortunately. So we want the world democracies to stay strong, because according to my understanding of the situation, I'm not a military expert, but of course as an ambassador I meted the analysts, I'm talking to the European ambassadors, US, I've been speaking to your government. We are trying to create the same thing of the strategic advice for our government, what to do in this situation in order to stop the killing the civilians, in order to stop the crime against the humanity. This is what's going on. And I'm sure you're aware that the European Hague Tribunal have accepted already the claim of Ukraine on the action against the humanity that is going on during this war. So whatever we can do in order to stop it as fast as we could will save the people's lives. So this is why we appreciate Mr. Bennett's effort. I know he is religious, and I know it's what was not the easy decision for him to fly to Moscow on Saturday. But he does it, and I know from the rabbis that this is only the exception of the rule, is to save the people's life. That's what you can do during Shabbat. And that's what he was trying to achieve, and my sincere regards to him personally and to Israeli government that is doing such an effort. But we want to be focused now, and we want to get the result now, not in the months when another hundreds of thousands of civilians will die. We will not surrender. But the mass of this tragedy is drastically moving up to the extent that it is just hard to believe in, hard to understand. So we also appreciate the decision of the Israeli government to provide us with a field hospital. This is something that we very much need. It was taken, but once again, we are deliberating about it for the 2 weeks. Finally taken, but we need it yesterday. We do appreciate the decision of the government to allow Ukrainian refugees to travel to Israel freely, with the minor exceptions that we will discuss with the Minister Sheket tomorrow. But initially that was no, and I know, as a lawyer, I know it's important to understand that we don't have the refugee legislation here, unlike Europeans or Americans do. But this is the action, that shows solidarity of the people of Israel with their Ukrainian friends. And assuming that the mass catastrophe is happening in Israel, believe me, it's not the cheapest place to come for Ukrainians. Normally, 90% of them will come here from the second countries, of course, because no flights already from Ukraine. Not because of they decided to stay here, but because of they have relatives or friends that can support them financially or give them the shelter. And this is what they've been looking for. For your knowledge, the European governments decided to finance the support of the refugees within €500 million yesterday. And the number of the refugees to Europe and Moldova is currently 1.5 million already. And this number is growing. Vice versa, we are having a substantial amount of the Ukrainians that are coming back to Ukraine, mainly male with a weapon to defend their country. We have about 100,000 people came back for the last 2 weeks. And a few hundreds of thousands are basically joined the armed forces as a reservists. So, once again, I don't want to come up with the figures, because I think you can get them from the official sources. And I want to thank you all to be here, and thank Israeli government. In a very separate manner, I love to express our gratitude to Israeli people that are supporting us heavily. Just, you saw the mass demonstrations in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and the other major cities. The size of the humanitarian aid that have been currently gathered by the people is 400 metric tons, and our stocks are full. So I get to the press conference yesterday saying, please stop doing that because we are stuck. So now Israeli government promised to help us with transportation. So we are working on that right now with the Prime Minister's office. And additionally, the 100 tons was already passed by the Israeli government last week. But when we are talking about humanitarian aid, you have to be specific. At most what we need is the pharmaceutical products, antibiotics, etc. And of course we are grateful if we are getting the water purifiers or pampers for the children, but this is secondary, because we are in a war, severe war at the moment, and we need help that will help our military and civilians and the rescue and the firefighters and police to carry their job. I was already mentioning the issue. You don't need to explain me that Russia is your northern neighbor. I'm an ambassador here, so I do understand that you have to care about your own interests. Please you understand as well that we are in a clear situation where you can see that you heard the expression friend in need is a friend indeed, right? So if you are not blocking the adversary, our enemy, this is meaning that you are basically supporting the action against humanity. So you know about the Europeans and American sanctions against the Russian Federation. And I admire your position as an intermediary. You have to be balanced. But we was talking yesterday with the Israeli businesses to stop working with the Russian companies. We do talk with the Israeli air carriers and the vessels that are supporting trade with Russia. So it's all important for us to show the solidarity of the Israel to the extent you can in order to support Ukraine in this current bloody warfare that we did not intend to start. So whatever has been done, and I'm glad we are meeting in the think tank here, but again, I started from saying that we don't have to look for the rational in the current circumstances. But whatever can be done at the moment in order to support Ukraine, we will be highly appreciated. And once again, the last thing I want to tell you that we needed this help now, not tomorrow, not mañana, and not in 2 weeks. We need it immediately. So please, I'll be happy to answer your questions if needed, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Let me say that the display of pain and emotion that you show is very much a reflection of the human tragedy that is unfolding in front of us. And so we take it as that. Let me ask a question, and then we'll open to questions from our researchers. You mentioned the mediating role that our Prime Minister has undertaken, and you seem very skeptical. You said essentially you need two to tango, and so far it seems to be there is only one party to the tango. Do you think that there is any chance that this will bring about perhaps a ceasefire? And if so, can you envision some sort of negotiated agreement? What will be the contours of such an agreement?
Listen, what I strongly believe is that our northern neighbors don't foresee us as the immediate enemy. It doesn't have much logic under this assumption, but I do believe that while they fight in Ukraine, they fight all democratic world. They are fighting against Europeans, NATO, United States. So this is in their sick minds. And clearly, you saw that I can prove my words, mentioning that Mr. Zelensky, our president, was trying to speak and meet with Mr. Putin many times, and he always was rejected to do so, which proved that the Russian leadership will speak to Americans about Ukraine, to NATO about Ukraine, to Chinese about Ukraine, but not to Ukrainians about Ukraine. Which means that we basically have to focus on a proper negotiation scenario, team, if you wish, in order for him to see that he is speaking to the audience that he want to listen. Because clearly this group, current peace talking group, which has met yesterday third time, they roughly did not achieve even the proper manner of the humanitarian corridors. Basically nothing. Which is proving my perceptions that we need to find the proper instruments of talk, where Ukraine would be the party, but Ukraine will not be alone, because they don't want to talk to us. Okay? So, this is one thing. And secondly, the sanctions that was imposed over the last 2 weeks, they are unprecedented. And I do believe that they will bring economically Russian Federation to the situation that is currently experienced in North Korea or your sincere friends in Iran. But that would take time, and we don't have such a time. This is why my opinion, that we have to think creatively and find the proper negotiation team that will start speaking to Moscow rather sooner than later, in order to cease fire as a step number one, and in order to achieve the mutually amicable result. Now, if you come to the history of the Minsk agreements, no, first let me go all the way down to Budapest Memorandum, which is a document that was signed back in 1994 in Budapest, Hungary. That was a document that was signed under the according to the Ukrainian parliament, that's supposed to join non-proliferation agreement. So, as a predecessor for the non-proliferation agreement that Ukraine is supposed to become the party to, the Ukrainian parliament asked the government to sign this agreement, where we gave up as the Ukraine as a state the whole nuclear arsenal, and it was basically number 3 in the world at that time in terms of the size of the nuclear arsenal. And in exchange, the other countries granted our independence and territorial integrity. That was Russia, that was US, and Great Britain. And later, because that was an open documents, the China and France joined this memorandum as well. And some might claim now that that was not legally binding documents, which I don't believe is the case. You know, in terms of the international public law, you know, I was teaching at the Kiev State University for many years. And, it doesn't matter how you call this the treaty, whether it's memorandum or even exchange of the diplomatic notes. It is a treaty, and treaties have to be obeyed by both sides. So when Russia breached this memorandum, while they take over Ukraine back in 2014, they come along. Ukraine was not the party for any military alliances. It was neutral. So now they're asking us to claim that we are neutral again, even though we are not invited to NATO. We have this willingness. Our people express it openly that we want to become the part of the NATO, but NATO doesn't want us. probably simply because they don't want to defend us. We do understand it, but the neutrality probably is not the case at the moment. So when the first and the second Minsk agreement was signed back in 2014 and 2015, the second one was worse than the first one in terms of the obligation that Ukraine had to take in order to achieve the peace process, the ceasefire. But both of those agreements was signed under the threat of the fire. It was active battles going on the east, which, for me as a lawyer, means that every agreement that have been signed under this threat is null and void. Okay? Now they are trying, the Russian invaders are trying to push us hard in order to sign the third Minsk agreement that should be worse than the previous ones, under the threat of force, which also going to be null and void. Legally. Once again, we are here with the intellectuals. So this is why we need the think tank created by those nations that would be admired, if you wish, by the Russian leadership in order to work out the peace agreement that would be in the interest of the Ukrainian people. So, and if you talk about the leverage, clearly the Russian leadership, supposed to have much greater leverage over the Ukraine within the last 12 days, and we see where they stay. But they wouldn't care, unlike us, they wouldn't care about the number of the soldiers that died. I don't know whether you heard about that, but they brought with them the mobile crematoriums to Ukraine in order to hide the number of the soldiers that would be killed during the warfare. I could not believe on this. Facts, at the same time that we are living in a democratic world and at the 21st century. So the sanctions, of course, will work. The mothers of those deceased soldiers and officers will come up with the protests in Russia. And this is probably only the way that will give us the leverage to stop the war. But that will take time. And again, we don't have such a time. We want the bloodshed to be stopped immediately. That's what we care about, and we do ask you as a think tank, well known not just in Israel, probably in the whole Middle East, and the one is valued in the rest of the democratic world, to take a step and give us your advice of what should we do immediately in the current circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want just to mention that the Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich just joined us now. Please, Yoel, you would like to ask.
We will soon take some questions from the staff here. I just want to ask you the first question. How do you envision the day after? Will there be a fundamental change in the world order as we know it before the war has erupted?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think we are living in a different world already. And I hate to mention that to you, but don't be surprised if within the next weeks or even days, the Russian leadership will use the preventive nuclear bombs, both in Ukraine and within the territory of our neighbors. Because of this is a part of the strategy that was adopted by the Russian parliament and become the part of the strategy. So if the treaties doesn't work and they understand just the language of power. So we have to be well prepared. And we do have to understand that everything that will bring us to the fast ceasefire and the stop of this war will bring us to the different reality. Again, we must think twice whether the treaties that was signed with the Russian neighbors worth of anything, if any. So I have to remind you the famous expression of Bismarck, who says that the treaties that was signed with Russia doesn't cost the paper on which it was signed. Thank you.
No, actually, Kissinger said that oral commitments are not worth the paper they are not written on. If I may, two questions. One is, do you believe that, let's begin with Putin himself. I mean, there are speculations in the international press that Putin, let's say, is out of balance, put it mildly. That it's not the same person that he was a few years ago, that he's out of touch with reality, that he's surrounded by sycophants who tell him only what... I mean, actually, we did see how he was rebuking one of his advisors who didn't fully agree with him, telling him this is not what you are here for. So question number one is about the performance of Putin in person. Second, whether he's focused on Ukraine or whether it's more in mind in terms of changing the whole, say, call it international order with regard to Europe, the security balance and order in Europe.
So, in terms of the question number one, I am, Mr. Ambassador, I'm an ambassador myself, I'm not a psychologist. So I read lots of the information about the behavior and the comments of the French president, for example, that was stating that the person that he knew in 2019 is different from the one that he saw now. But what I will be rather focus on is not what he says, but what he does, on the action. You count on the people and you measure them, with not what they're saying, but what they've been doing. And for the last months, they are proclaiming one things and they are doing completely different, opposite things. So this is something that is threatening not just me, I think everybody else. And in terms of the question number two, I think I partially answered it. So we do strongly believe that fighting in Ukraine, he is not fighting Ukraine only. He is fighting the rest of the democratic world. You remember he started accusing the NATO and the Americans that they betrayed them and they fooled them, and the biggest loss was the loss of the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, and they started to bring on the table the demands that basically from the beginning would not be fulfilled, and everybody understood that. So I hope I answered your question. My understanding is that for the adversary, the Ukraine is the part of the game, but it's not the whole game.
Thank you.
Sina?
Take the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming here. We know that you are bothered with so many issues. Since my mother was born in Odessa, I have a very special feeling for Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, you very correctly said that the fight is the big one between the US and between Russia vis-a-vis the US. not NATO, but US is the issue. And the question that I wanted to pose actually is in two fronts. One, is the issue of the possibility that our Prime Minister Bennett will be a negotiator between the sides. Is it realistic in the case, as you have mentioned, that Russia wants at the end of the day to get to terms with the US and to feel on the same level, not vis-à-vis Israel, but vis-à-vis the US? So that's one question. And the other part of that, once we get to that point, and at the end of the day, every war is finished with a compromise, with a political decision. Do you think there is a zone of possible, ZOPA as we call it, the zone of possible agreement between Ukraine and Russia? And if there is, it should be put on the table, I think, earlier rather than later, because of the human cost that it caused.
Well, thank you for this question. And starting from the first part, I personally solicited the position that was taken by proactively taken by Prime Minister Bennett for a few months. Since he first was coming to Sochi in October, and he has had a phone call with Zelensky before he was going to Sochi to see what his position is. But really proactive role was taken just over the last few weeks. So, and if you are talking about those mediation process, my opinion, humble opinion, I'm rather lawyer than psychologist, but psychologically, it would be probably easier for the Russian leadership to speak with the Israelis about Ukraine, assuming that position is consolidated with the Americans and the Europeans, than with anybody else. Maybe Turks, but if you're talking about the democratic world, Israel is here in a unique position, being only the democratic country having good relations with both Ukraine and Russia. So this is why I stressed that many times, and I'm glad it's been heard, and the Israeli taking the very proactive role now. And I do believe that over the within just the next weeks, such a decision could be taken. And they are talking, your Prime Minister is speaking to our President, so yesterday they talked twice, and before the visit they spoke as well, on a different level, but doesn't matter. So we are keeping a very strong discussion level, on a think tank level between the leaders, but you clearly have to be proactive. And as I mentioned to you before, I do believe that being a good mediator is the Middle East business. So you guys know what you're doing. But number two, the second part of the question is, of course, the leverage is not there for both sides. So what the Russians want to achieve at the beginning, they want to surrender. So they're going to get surrender. And the time is playing, I believe, in our support rather than in their support, because the sanctions will stop slowly but strongly, preventing them from doing that, because the war costs money every single day, the millions and millions of dollars. So from Ukrainian side, we clearly draw the line, and we do believe that if they want us to be neutral and not to become the part of the NATO, this is something that can be achieved. But I told you, it was neutral when they took over Crimea. It was neutral. So we need, at that point, we need the strong international guarantees, like what Austria has done in, I believe, in '55, when the both Western and the Russian troops left Vienna. Austria got the guarantees for its integrity and independence, and in exchange, it voted for the neutral status. Okay? So if you could find such the balance, that would be acceptable. But if Russian leadership now is saying us that we also have to recognize Crimea and this parts of Donbass that they belong to Russia or their independence, so it's just not possible. So I was in the parliament myself, and you know, to be the politician is a different role. So I could assure you that every single politician that will recognize the Crimea belong to Russia will be having a zero support within the public opinion at the same moment. Okay? It could be a different scheme. I'm thinking loud. I'm nobody to tell you what the decision will be taken in Kyiv, even though we are directly liaison with the president office. But for example, Japan never recognized Kuril Islands over the Soviet Union, but that did not prevent them to trade, and you know, they didn't even sign the peace agreement after the World War II, as far as I remember. Or Finland, look on the other side. You know, it has lots of examples. At least I could give you a few that are, you know, that we can live with. So even without recognition of Crimea, we could leave this issue on the side, okay? And achieve the ceasefire, and then work out the agreement similar to what Austria have got on the 55, in exchange for our neutrality again. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Mark Regev.
Can I say Mark Regev? Can I say Mark Regev is the former Israeli ambassador to London, to the UK.
And your babushka is from Odessa.
No, I'm afraid not.
I'm joking. I'm trying to joke because
You need a bit of humor.
yeah, I need a bit of humor for sure.
Ambassador, once again, I join my colleagues in thanking you for coming on what must be a very, very difficult and busy time for you as the Ambassador of Ukraine to Israel. I want to ask you a question about Roman Brodsky. We saw the film. He was apparently killed by accident by an overzealous Ukrainian security personnel. We in Israel know these accidents can happen. It happens with our forces too. You can kill someone accidentally without intention. Did you visit the family? Did you express condolences? Does the Ukrainian state take any responsibility for this death? And a second question, you made me think at the beginning when you spoke about the Yom Kippur War, and you made a comparison. Yom Kippur War is a national trauma for Israel, and afterwards there was a whole self-searching process and public criticism of the government for mishandling the process. This is part of democracy, yes? People criticize you. Ukraine is a democracy. Do you presume that when this is over, and like you, I hope it will be over soon, that there will be a discussion in Ukraine that will ask, did the government in the months leading up to this conflict, did you take the steps that you could have taken? I'm not asking something that we didn't do in Israel. There was much criticism of Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan after the Yom Kippur War. Do you expect that Ukrainian democracy would also involve such a process?
First question, it's very touchy, because when I saw the casualty happen, from the first sources, it was the information published that the Israeli was killed by the Russians, and a bit later the information came up that what he was killed by the local militia because he was looked similar to some Chechnya, whatever, soldiers. I'm not sure what happened, but I know that investigation is going on there right now about this issue. But you're absolutely right. as soon as I will get the information about the investigation, we will definitely visit the family and express our condolences, if that's the Ukrainian militia that caused this death. And this is very unfortunate for us, if that's the truth. But I've been waiting. We requested this information. We are waiting for the Ministry of Interior. And the question number 2, Ukrainians love to criticize each other. You would not believe to what extent. Our political parties was fighting in the parliament like crazy up to the beginning of war. And the war made us united as a whole country the way it have never been united, ever, for the 30 years of our current independence. So you could not see the difference between West and the East, because it was lots of the rumors that on the East people are much, say, pro-Russian or Russian speakers. Being Russian speaker doesn't mean to be pro-Russian. And that's what's been shown in Kharkiv and Mariupol at the moment. And Kherson, which was also, probably in Kherson is half of the people speak Russian. So once again, I might be criticized by my capital, but I do believe that Switzerland or small Singapore have 4 national languages. What prevents us of having 2 or 3 national languages? I don't see the problem on that. But the problem is that the hatred and anxiety among the society to our northern nations grown to such a big extent now that you would not even publicly speak about that now. I don't know how we will look on the eyes of the Russians after the war ended. I don't know. I have relatives there. I have lots of friends. I studied in Minsk, in Belarus. I don't know. And I openly asking myself one question: what did we do to Russians in order for our people to get killed and in order for our women to get raped? I don't know. I don't understand. So, if we are talking about this matter of well, I assume I answered fully your question. Sorry.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for being here, and also let me pass my sympathy to the people of Ukraine and to their, I think, to their suffering, and also to the heroism we see there. And I think we all support you and in this terrible phase you are overcoming. I wanted to ask, as an international lawyer, I know that Ukraine has approached the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights. There's also an investigation in the International Criminal Court. And I want to ask, what do you think, what does Ukraine think that can be achieved through these legal channels? Can they help in any way? Is it something that can change in any way what's happening now? Or maybe it's something that can be relevant for the future? And the second question, I think when you said, I think what Putin and the aggression of Russia is not only against the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine, it's, I think, against the notion of freedom of Ukrainians, the idea that they cannot choose for themselves what they want to be, and to, I think, topple democracy in Ukraine. And my question is, do you think, how strong is the Ukrainian democracy? Is it something that will overcome Russian repression, oppression, or is it still a fragile democracy? So those are my questions.
Okay, so number one, those international courts of human rights or criminal courts against humanity, it's all good, but it's all good at the end, after. Okay, it is important, and it would be heard. It might take some time. Sometime it will take probably the years to gather all the evidence and examine them and come up with the decisions. But that will happen later. What I urge you that we need as an immediate result now is a ceasefire. Okay? But I know that our government start to gather evidence of the brutal infringement of the international law that is going on in Ukraine since the day one of the war started. Okay? And secondly, they come up with the idea of the ad hoc like Potsdam Convention, or the one that happened after the World War II.
Genocide, and I don't know, like an ad hoc tribunal for aggression.
Yes, exactly. So they started working on that as well. But once again, those things are, good for the future, but not for the current situation in Ukraine. What was the second?
Of the democratic situation.
Yeah, the democracy is something that was not developed just over the last 30 years. If you look at our history, we are claiming to have the first democratic constitution being passed on the 15th century in Ukraine. Because Ukraine having the strongest, the long history. Kiev was metropolis before the Moscow was ever existed. So it was a metropolis in the 8th and 9th century. The first churches that you see in Kiev that was built in the 11th century. So that's why we're well known for our Cossack history of being the democratic state for a long time before the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is what is in Ukrainian blood. So you couldn't fight with that. So I do believe that democracy is something that very much bothers our northern neighbors. And this is why on the way, they want to prevent their own country to become a democratic state while they're fighting the democracy in Ukraine. Sorry, I have to leave in 10 minutes.
שאלות אחרונות, בזריזות, מרק ועודד.
Thank you. I share some genealogical roots with my colleague Sima. My mother is also not Odessa, near a small town near Lvov. So I shared that with her, but I'm not sure I share her characterization of the way that all wars end with some compromise. I think there are a great many wars which end quite differently, in which either one side surrenders, or weaker side, or the stronger side comes to the conclusion that the cost of pursuing the war is disproportionate or unacceptable to the gains it may expect to make. My question is there anything that you think Ukraine can do to impose that kind of calculation on Russia, on Putin, to make the cost of pursuing the war unacceptable, even if there's no realistic prospect of Ukraine defeating Russia? And to do that, what kind of assistance can you realistically demand from the rest of the world?
עודד.
Like all my colleagues, I share, and people in Israel, I share the sorrow, the pain. I found your comments on Austria as a precedent, neutrality, very interesting, because there is now consideration of thinking about Ukraine's joining NATO and the EU. There is some support in the EU. Someone who served in the EU, I think that it would take ages to become members in the EU. But does it mean that Ukraine will agree as part of an exit plan from the current crisis to at least delay its request for membership in NATO and the EU?
Let me start from the second question, it's easier. NATO and the EU is different bodies, and for Austria, example, the neutrality did not prevent them to be the part of the EU. Okay, so we're talking about neutrality. We're talking just about NATO, about military blocks, not about any economical. Okay. Secondly, I do believe that with Ukraine now proved to be the leader of democracy, and we do very much hope that we will be having the ability to join the EU on a fast process way, rather than it would take an ages. That's not acceptable for us. And that's what our leadership is working on right now very effectively with the EU country members. So most of them already supporting this idea, and we are so close to the decision, because our applications have been accepted just about a week ago on the expedited process, jointly. So NATO could be probably something that I already mentioned that could be avoided completely if we find the doable or strict measure to defend our values and interests against the neighbors outside of NATO under the Austrian principle, if you wish. Or you may look on Finland that is not also divided to the NATO, but having strong armed forces. So coming back to the first question, I do agree with you. We do work with all of our partners, including Israel, in order to make the price of Russia paying every day of this war higher and higher. This is why we are talking about sanctions, not just talking, we basically already received that the next package of the sanctions would be adopted this week, additional one. And we know that most of the European countries have already agreed not to buy the Russian oil and gas, which would be the worst thing for that environment. Americans have already agreed for that. Let's see on that. And once again, this is not about neutrality of Israel, taking into account the mediation role, but still we do believe that if Israel could make us having those prices higher for Russia to stop the war, we will appreciate that as well. But once again, if you do believe that you could help us to achieve the ceasefire and peace agreement, I will rather focus on the peace agreement. Thank you.
One last question from the media, please.
З вашого дозволення українською мовою.
Sound like a music.
Є дуже сильна підтримка України з Ізраїлю. Я вірю, що ви це можете бачити. Це безперечно. Но що людина Ізраїля, прості людина Ізраїля можуть робити в цей момент, які практичні дії для підтримки України і може бути для підтримки Збройних сил України. Вне зв'язку з офіційною владою Ізраїлю.
So what the practical steps could be done by the regular people in Israel? The practical steps that could be done without any harm to the position of the state, of course, is financial aid. We are currently banned on the humanitarian, because as soon as we send this 400 tons, anger will be probably start gathering again, because you see that the damage there is so huge that it's going to be a big need. Secondly, if you have the relatives or friends that you are willing to save or have here with you during the crisis, please invite them. And if you can help them financially to come here and either pay the bail if that's just the friends or give the guarantee, please do so, because that's something that will be counted as well. So, but we will appreciate just the supports on the demonstrations or whatever can be done, so please do so. If you feel with your heart that you can do something, don't hesitate. And don't wait for the embassy or somebody else to say what to do. Because we are working in our cultural center 24/7 now with people that willing to support. So we are having not just the common people, we are having the good lawyers that helping us, we are having the PR companies that helping us. So the different professionals that are helping us on different levels. And thank you very much for that. I want to thank all the Israelis.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your words. We take several of your messages are very important. We as a think tank, we're going to devote to some of the ideas that you floated here a lot of thought, and we'll try to bring that to our government as well in its mediating role. You heard the expressions of sympathy, and it's very deeply rooted, and we will try to act also at various levels to help out. Let me just finish. I just read a couple of days ago an article by a Ukrainian philosopher named Volodymyr Yermolenko. He wrote an article at The Economist, an important magazine. It's a very interesting article, but in it he had this sentence that I thought it was very interesting. He says, Ukrainians do not harbor nostalgia. The past is mostly a painful experience for us, therefore we do not look back to any golden age. You cannot win elections in Ukraine with a slogan such as, make Ukraine great again. We look more to the future than to the past. So what I wanted to tell you is that we wish you that the future will look much brighter, and we are here to help you achieve that.
That's what makes us tremendously different from our northern neighbors.
Yes.
We are not looking on the past. We are looking on the European future of Ukraine together with the rest of the democratic world. Thank you very much.